What if the man waiting at the altar wasn't trying to win your heart, but to settle a debt buried years before you ever met? Savannah's fingers froze around the wedding bouquet as a folded letter slipped from an old leather satchel onto the church floor. Outside, a horse stamped against the hitching rail. Inside, the bell above the chapel door rang once. Across the room, the cowboy she was about to marry stood perfectly still, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on that letter. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Savannah noticed the name written across the page, and suddenly the wedding wasn't the only thing hanging in the balance. What had Wyatt been hiding all this time? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and join us for this unforgettable journey. 3 weeks before her wedding, Savannah Brooks stood on the wooden porch of the Brooks Trading Post and watched the morning fog drift over Cotton Run. The creek cut a silver line through the valley below. Beyond it stretched miles of open grassland, broken fences, and distant pine-covered ridges. A wagon rattled along the dirt road toward town. Somewhere far off, cattle bawled. Everything looked ordinary. That was what troubled her. A woman should have been thinking about her wedding dress, the church flowers, or whether enough coffee would be brewed for the guests. Instead, Savannah could not stop watching the road. She was waiting for Wyatt Mercer. Not because he had promised to come, because she had spent the entire night thinking about what Ruby Calloway had said. The words still sat inside her like a stone. "He didn't come back for you, Savannah." Ruby had spoken softly, but the sentence had landed hard. He came back for the Brooks family. The evening before, the two women had sat behind the trading post while the sun disappeared behind Juniper Ridge. Ruby twisted a piece of sewing thread around her finger and told Savannah everything people were saying. About Wyatt, about the Mercer Ranch, about the water rights at Cotton Run, about the losses that followed, and about the possibility that Wyatt's proposal had never been about love at all. Savannah wanted to dismiss it. She truly did. But rumors survived a long time in small towns because they usually carried at least one grain of truth. She heard hoofbeats before she saw him. Wyatt Mercer appeared along the road riding a bay gelding. He sat tall in the saddle, hat pulled low against the morning sun. Nothing about him looked dramatic. No grand gestures, no hurry, just the same quiet man she had known for years. He slowed near the front gate and tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Brooks." Savannah smiled automatically. "Morning." He asked about a shipment of feed that was due later that afternoon. They exchanged a few practical words. Then he rode on toward the north pasture. That was all. No declarations, no performance, just Wyatt. Savannah watched until he disappeared behind a stand of cottonwoods. If he was carrying revenge, he hid it well. Later that day, she walked into Miller's Diner near the center of town. The smell of coffee, bacon grease, and fresh biscuits filled the room. She took a seat near the window. 2 ranchers occupied a table behind her. At first, she ignored them. Then she heard Wyatt's name. One man lowered his voice. Mercer didn't spend 8 years rebuilding himself for nothing. The other chuckled. "You really think he wants the girl?" A pause followed. Then came the sentence that refused to leave her. "Mercer doesn't need the girl. He needs the Brooks name." Savannah's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. The men never noticed her. They kept talking while she stared through the window at the dusty street outside. A wagon rolled past. A dog slept beneath the boardwalk. Life continued as if nothing had happened, yet something had changed. That night, the wind moved softly through the valley. Savannah sat beside her bedroom window long after the lamps downstairs were extinguished. The moonlight silvered the fence posts beyond the house. 3 weeks. Only 3 weeks until she would stand beside Wyatt Mercer before the preacher. 3 weeks until she promised him the rest of her life. She could walk away. No one would stop her. Instead, Savannah rose from her chair and crossed the room. She folded the wedding fabric carefully and placed it back inside the cedar chest. Then she looked out toward the dark outline of Cotton Run. No. She would not run from rumors, and she would not marry a man she did not understand. If there was truth hidden inside the story of Wyatt Mercer and her family, she intended to find it herself. Outside, somewhere beyond the creek and the sleeping pastures, a lone coyote called into the night. Savannah listened until the sound faded. Then she made her decision. She would uncover the truth before the wedding, no matter where it led. The next morning arrived cold and clear. A pale layer of frost clung to the fence rails outside the trading post. Savannah stood at the kitchen table with a tin cup of coffee warming her hands. Downstairs, she could hear workers unloading sacks of flour from a wagon that had arrived before sunrise. Everything felt ordinary again. Yet she found herself looking toward the road every few minutes, not waiting for Wyatt, watching him. That became her quiet habit over the following days. She never announced it, never asked questions. She simply paid attention. 3 days later, she saw him outside the Parker place, a small ranch sitting alone near the eastern ridge. Widow Parker had lived there by herself since her husband died 2 winters earlier. One of her pasture fences had collapsed after a windstorm. Savannah watched from a distance while delivering invoices to a neighboring ranch. Wyatt worked steadily beneath the afternoon sun. Post, hammer, wire, no audience, no praise. When Widow Parker offered him money, he shook his head. Savannah couldn't hear the words, but she saw the older woman smile and wipe her eyes before he rode away. The image stayed with her. A week earlier, she might have dismissed it. Now she wasn't so sure. 2 days after that, she saw him again. A young boy named Tommy Fletcher had lost a horse somewhere beyond Cotton Run. The entire town knew the animal was the family's only reliable workhorse. Near dusk, Savannah saw Wyatt leading the missing horse back toward town. The boy ran across the street so fast, he nearly lost a boot. Wyatt handed him the reins. Nothing more. No speech. No celebration. Just a brief nod before he continued walking. The same man people claimed was planning revenge. The same man she was supposed to marry. The contradiction bothered her more than the rumors ever had. One afternoon, she found herself riding near the canyon trail west of Juniper Ridge. The path curved between weathered rocks and scattered pine trees. Without warning, a memory returned. 3 years earlier, spring runoff, fast water, a frightened horse. She had been trapped halfway down a rocky ledge after a sudden flash flood swept through the narrow pass. She remembered the sound first, rushing water, breaking branches, then Wyatt. He had appeared without warning, calm, focused. He never grabbed her, never barked orders. Instead, he spoke slowly, carefully, as if he trusted her to think. "One step at a time, Miss Brooks." She remembered his hand reaching out, and the strange relief she felt when she finally reached solid ground. Afterward, he had checked her scraped wrist, asked if she was hurt, then ridden away. He never mentioned it again. Savannah hadn't thought about that day in years. Now she wondered why. Late one evening, she stopped by old Ben Carter's bunkhouse. The old cattleman sat outside sharpening a pocket knife beneath a lantern. The smell of tobacco drifted through the cool air. "You knew the Mercers, didn't you?" Savannah asked. Old Ben nodded slowly. Knew both families. For a while, neither spoke. Then the old man glanced toward the dark valley. "That boy carries more weight than folks realize." Savannah waited. Old Ben slid the knife shut. "People think anger is loud. Most times it ain't." "What do you mean?" He looked at her for a long moment. Wyatt Mercer has spent years learning how to keep certain things buried. The answer explained nothing, yet somehow it felt important. As Savannah prepared to leave, something caught her eye through the bunkhouse window. A saddlebag rested on a nearby chair. She recognized it. It belonged to Wyatt. Old Ben often repaired tack for local ranchers. The flap had been left partially open. Inside was a folded piece of blue cloth. Savannah froze. She knew that cloth. Years ago, during a summer fair, she had lost a small embroidered handkerchief near the church picnic grounds, blue fabric, white stitching, her initials sewn carefully into one corner. SB. The same handkerchief now rested inside Wyatt Mercer's saddlebag. Not hidden, not displayed, simply kept. For years. Savannah stared at it in silence. Old Ben followed her gaze but said nothing. The evening wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse snorted softly. Savannah suddenly realized she was asking the wrong question. Maybe the question was not whether Wyatt hated her family. Maybe the real question was why a man carrying that much history would keep a forgotten handkerchief all this time. And for the first time since Ruby's warning, she found herself wondering something entirely different. What if she didn't know Wyatt Mercer at all? What if the truth was far more complicated than revenge? As she walked home beneath a sky full of stars, the blue handkerchief stayed fixed in her mind, waiting. Like an answer she had not yet learned how to read. For the next several days, Savannah carried the image of that blue handkerchief everywhere she went. She saw it while sorting invoices at the trading post. She saw it while measuring coffee beans into paper sacks. She saw it when she woke before dawn and listened to the wind brushing against the side of the house. The question refused to leave her alone. A man could keep anger alive for years. But why would he keep a handkerchief? One cold morning, Savannah saddled her mare and rode into town before most businesses opened. The streets of Juniper Ridge were quiet, except for a delivery wagon unloading barrels behind the general store. She tied her horse outside the marshal's office. Marshal Henry Dawson looked surprised when she stepped through the door. The older man sat behind a desk crowded with maps, property filings, and weathered record books. "What can I do for you, Miss Brooks?" Savannah hesitated only briefly. "I need to see the old land records around Cotton Run." The marshal studied her face. Something in her expression must have convinced him. Without another question, he stood and walked toward a row of cabinets lining the back wall. Dust floated through the sunlight as he pulled out several ledgers. The search took nearly 2 hours. Page after page passed beneath Savannah's fingers. Property transfers, water agreements, grazing rights, loan filings. Then she found it. The Mercer name. Her heartbeat slowed. A document dated nearly 10 years earlier rested between 2 routine filings. Savannah read it once, then again, and then a third time. The Mercer family had not lost their ranch because of unpaid debts alone. The real damage began when they lost access to Cotton Run. Without reliable water, cattle numbers dropped, pastures weakened, income disappeared. The ranch slowly collapsed afterward. Savannah kept reading. Another document revealed something even worse. Ezekiel Brooks had signed an agreement months before the new cattle route crossed through the valley. He had known Cotton Run would become valuable, very valuable. The realization settled heavily inside her. This wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. Someone had seen opportunity coming and acted first. The marshal quietly poured 2 cups of coffee from a dented pot. He placed one beside her. Savannah barely noticed. "Sometimes," Henry Dawson said carefully, "the hardest thing about records is they don't care who gets hurt." Savannah stared at the papers. For the first time in her life, she felt as though she were looking at a stranger when she thought about Ezekiel Brooks. That evening, she returned home after sunset. The trading post was nearly empty. Only a single lantern burned inside the office. Ezekiel sat at his desk reviewing freight receipts. His reading glasses rested low on his nose. He looked up when she entered. "You're late." Savannah closed the door behind her. "I was at the marshal's office." The older man's eyes narrowed slightly. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Savannah placed copies of the documents on the desk. Ezekiel looked down. His expression changed very little, which somehow made everything worse. "You knew," Savannah said quietly. The room felt smaller. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder. Ezekiel removed his glasses. "I knew the water would matter. You took it anyway." A long silence followed. Outside, wagon wheels rolled past on the dirt road. Inside, neither moved. Finally, Ezekiel leaned back in his chair. "In this part of the country, people survive by seeing things before everyone else does." Savannah felt her stomach tighten. "That's your answer?" "It is. No apology, no denial, no attempt to soften it. Just the truth." For the first time, Savannah understood why people spoke about business and morality as if they were different things. She left the office before saying anything she might regret. The night air was cold. Stars filled the Montana sky. She walked toward the stable and stopped. A memory suddenly returned. Not a memory of Ezekiel, a memory of Wyatt. Months earlier, during a conversation outside the feed store, Wyatt had mentioned Cotton Run. Only briefly. Only once. At the time, she hadn't understood why the subject mattered. Now she did. The realization struck her like a sudden gust of wind. Wyatt had known. He had known the truth about Cotton Run all along. He had known what happened to his family. He had known what Ezekiel Brooks had done. And yet he had never told her. Savannah stood motionless beside the stable fence. The mystery she thought she was solving had only grown larger. Was Wyatt protecting her from the truth? Or had he simply been waiting for the right moment? Above her, the stars burned bright over Juniper Ridge. And for the first time since beginning her search, Savannah was no longer certain which answer frightened her more. The days that followed passed quietly, too quietly. The wedding was now less than 24 hours away. Women from town came and went carrying fabric, flowers, and trays for the church supper. Wagon wheels rolled across the yard. Coffee boiled from sunrise until dark. Around her, everyone behaved as though the future had already been decided. Only Savannah knew how uncertain it felt. Late the afternoon before the wedding, she found herself staring out the office window while a customer signed a freight receipt. Beyond the glass, she could see Cotton Run shining beneath the fading sun. And somewhere beyond that water was Wyatt Mercer, the man who knew the truth, the man who had never told her. That evening, after supper, Savannah slipped out of the house. The air had turned cold. A wind moved through the juniper trees that covered the lower slopes of the ridge. She knew exactly where to find him. The Mercer horses were being kept in a long barn near the foothills west of town. By the time she arrived, darkness had settled over the valley. Lantern light spilled through the cracks in the wooden walls. Inside, horses shifted quietly in their stalls. A hoof struck the packed dirt floor. Leather creaked. Wyatt stood near a workbench repairing a bridle. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he looked up. The moment his eyes found hers, he set the bridle down. "Savannah." His voice was calm, as always. She suddenly realized how tired she was of calm answers. "You knew." The words left her before she could soften them. Wyatt didn't pretend to misunderstand. He simply nodded once. "Yes." The lantern flame flickered between them. Savannah folded her arms tightly. "You knew what happened to your family." "Yes." "You knew what Ezekiel did." Another pause. "Yes." The answers came without hesitation. without excuses. That somehow made them harder to hear. Savannah looked away toward the nearest stall. A chestnut mare lifted its head and watched them. "Then why didn't you tell me?" For the first time that evening, Wyatt hesitated. He rubbed one hand across the back of his neck before answering. "When would you have wanted me to?" She said nothing, because she didn't have an answer. Wyatt stepped closer to the workbench, but not closer to her. Always careful, always giving her space. "When I first came back to Juniper Ridge," he said quietly, "I was angry." The words settled heavily in the barn. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls. Savannah waited. "My father spent years trying to save that ranch." Wyatt's eyes remained fixed on the lantern. "I buried him, believing he'd died, thinking he'd failed us." Savannah lowered her gaze. She could hear the hurt beneath the steady voice. Not loud, not dramatic, just old. "I came back carrying that anger." He finally looked at her. "And for a while I thought about making Ezekiel Brooks feel some of what my family felt." Savannah's breath caught. There it was. The thing she had feared from the beginning. Neither moved. Then Wyatt continued. "And then one winter morning I saw you." Savannah blinked. The change in direction surprised her. Wyatt's expression softened slightly. There was a family outside Miller's store. A ranch hand had gotten hurt. They barely had enough money to buy food. Savannah remembered. Only vaguely. Years ago, snow on the ground. A worried mother. 2 hungry children. "You paid for their groceries." He gave a small shrug. "You probably forgot about it by supper." She had. "What does that have to do with this?" A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Everything." The barn grew very still. "I spent years believing the Brooks family was one thing." His voice lowered. "Then I kept seeing you prove me wrong." Savannah felt her throat tighten. The lantern cast warm gold across the rough wooden walls. Somewhere outside, a horse snorted softly. Wyatt looked down briefly. When he spoke again, his voice carried none of the caution it usually did. "I don't remember exactly when I started loving you." The words were simple, honest. No grand speech, no performance. Just the truth. Maybe it was after the flood near Cotton Run. He shook his head slightly. Maybe before that. Savannah could not look away. "All I know is that somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about revenge." The silence that followed felt larger than the barn itself, larger than the valley, larger than the years between their families. Savannah wanted to answer, wanted to say something. Instead, she found herself staring at the man standing before her. Not the rumor, not the story. The man. Finally, she stepped back. Wyatt's expression changed slightly. Not disappointment. Understanding. He knew she needed time. Savannah turned toward the door. Her hand rested briefly on the wooden frame. Then she looked back. Their eyes met. Neither smiled. Neither spoke. Yet something had changed. Something important. The wind greeted her as she stepped into the night. Above Juniper Ridge, countless stars stretched across the sky. Tomorrow she would stand beside Wyatt Mercer before the preacher. Tomorrow she would have to make her choice. And as she rode home beneath the moonlight, one thought followed her all the way back to town. She no longer feared the truth Wyatt had told her. She feared the truth that might still be waiting beyond it. Morning arrived beneath a pale Montana sky. Thin clouds drifted over Juniper Ridge while wagons rolled toward the church from every direction. Savannah stood in a small room behind the sanctuary, smoothing the front of her wedding dress. The fabric was simple, cream-colored, nothing extravagant, just something practical and beautiful enough for the occasion. Through the window, she could see townspeople gathering outside. She could see horses tied to fence rails, children chasing one another through patches of yellow grass. Life moving forward. Ruby stood beside her. "You still have time to change your mind." Savannah looked toward the churchyard. Wyatt stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with old Ben Carter. Even from a distance, he seemed calm, steady. The same man she had met beside rivers, fences, and dusty roads. The same man who had finally told her the truth. "No," Savannah said softly. "I don't." A few minutes later, the church bell rang. The ceremony was small, simple, the way most weddings were in that part of Montana. When Savannah stepped through the front doors, every conversation stopped. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Dust floated in the bright beams above the pews. Wyatt turned. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither looked away. Then the preacher began. The vows were spoken. Promises were made. And when it was time to answer, Savannah's voice never shook. "I do." A quiet smile appeared in Wyatt's eyes. Not a large smile. Just enough. By the time the guests gathered outside for supper, the valley seemed lighter somehow. Coffee simmered in large pots. Roasted beef filled the air with its rich smell. Neighbors laughed. Children ran between tables. For the first time in weeks, Savannah allowed herself to breathe. Maybe the hardest part was finally over. She was wrong. 3 weeks later, old Ben Carter arrived at their porch carrying a weathered leather satchel. The old cattleman looked unusually serious. "I found something." Inside the satchel rested a bundle of papers. Letters. Receipts. Old contracts. Documents forgotten in a storage cabinet behind a former freight office. One letter caught everyone's attention. It was addressed to Ezekiel Brooks. The signature at the bottom belonged to Calvin Pierce. Savannah read the letter once, then again. The room grew silent. Years earlier, Calvin Pierce had known the value of Cotton Run before anyone else. His transportation company needed reliable water access along future cattle routes. He had pressured Ezekiel into helping secure control of the area. Money, influence, promises of profit. The pieces finally fit together. Ezekiel had participated, but he had not created the scheme alone. The true architect had been Calvin Pierce. News spread through Juniper Ridge within days. By Sunday, nearly the entire town attended the community meeting. The gathering took place inside the town hall. Every bench was filled. Ranchers stood along the walls. Store owners crowded near the back. Calvin Pierce arrived confident as ever. That confidence faded when old Ben placed the letters on the table. One by one, the documents were read aloud. No shouting followed. No violence. Only silence. The kind that settles over a room when people realize they have misunderstood a story for years. Calvin's explanations sounded weaker with every page. By the end of the meeting, nobody was listening anymore. His reputation collapsed long before he left the building. A month later, Ezekiel Brooks requested a meeting with Wyatt. The two men stood beside Cotton Run beneath a gray autumn sky. Savannah watched from a distance. Ezekiel handed over signed transfer papers. Land surrounding the creek, the same land connected to the old dispute. "You should have had it years ago," Ezekiel said. Wyatt studied the documents, then surprised everyone, including Savannah. "I won't take it for myself." Ezekiel frowned. "What?" Wyatt folded the papers carefully. This land caused enough damage. The creek moved quietly beside them. Sunlight reflected from the water. "We manage it together." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ezekiel slowly nodded. It was not forgiveness. Not completely. but it was a beginning. The following spring arrived with green grass and strong water flowing through Cotton Run. Calves wandered through open pastures. Fence posts rose along new property lines. The valley looked alive again. One afternoon, Savannah stood on the porch of their home watching Wyatt repair a section of fence near the creek. His hammer struck wood in a steady rhythm. Beyond him stretched the land that had once divided families. Now it connected them. Ruby visited that same day. The two women sat together beneath the shade of the porch roof. For a while they simply watched the valley. Then Ruby smiled. "So tell me." Savannah glanced over. Ruby nodded toward Wyatt. "What did he really come back for?" Savannah watched her husband set another fence post. A breeze moved through the cottonwoods. The sound of flowing water drifted across the pasture. For a moment she thought about everything that had happened. The rumors, the anger, the secrets, the years both families had lost. Then she smiled. Maybe he came back carrying revenge. Ruby waited. Savannah looked toward Wyatt again, but he stayed because of love. As if sensing her gaze, Wyatt lifted his head. Their eyes met across the distance. Neither waved, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The distance between them was no longer very far, and for the first time in a long while, the future seemed larger than the past. As the sun settled over Juniper Ridge and the water of Cotton Run carried the last light of the day, it became clear that this story had never really been about land, contracts, or old mistakes. It was about what people choose to carry, and what they finally decide to set down. Imagine standing where Savannah once stood. Imagine learning that the person you love is tied to the deepest wound your family ever caused. Would you walk away? Or would you stay long enough to learn the whole truth? And imagine standing where Wyatt stood, carrying years of hurt, years of unanswered questions, then discovering that healing asks more of you than revenge ever could. Maybe that's what stays with me most. Not the conflict, not the secrets, but the quiet courage it takes to give someone a second chance when every reason in the world tells you not to. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive with grand speeches. Sometimes it looks like patience, a kept promise, a hand that stays when it would be easier to leave. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments. Do you believe people can truly let go of old hurts and start over? And if stories like this make your evenings a little warmer, I hope you'll stay a while. There are still more dusty roads to travel, more hidden truths to uncover, and more hearts searching for their way home. I'd be honored to share those stories with you in the next journey.